They fired me by email while I was planning their 20th anniversary party. No call, no warning, just return your badge. What they didn't know? I still legally owned the building that housed their entire data center, and I gave them 48 hours to get out. My name is Karen Doyle. I'm 41 years old, and I've lived in Denver most of my adult life. I used to be the office manager at Velmanics Consulting, a mid-sized data analytics firm with big ambitions and even bigger egos. These days, I run a quiet little bookkeeping service from home, which suits me just fine. But just a few months ago, I was deep in the grind working 60-hour weeks, juggling logistics, managing vendors, onboarding employees, troubleshooting supply issues, and doing just about everything except taking credit for my own contributions. I'd been at Velmanics for 12 years. I joined the company back when there were only 7 of us in a cramped office above a wine bar. We shared a microwave, a printer that only worked if you kicked it, and a dream that maybe one day we'd matter in the industry. And for a while, I really believed we would. The week I got fired, I was in the middle of planning our 20th anniversary celebration. It was the kind of event that should have had its own committee, but like everything else, it somehow landed in my lap. I was arranging catering, booking the venue, coordinating flights for a few out-of-state clients, including one flying in from Toronto, who had never been to Colorado, and putting together gift bags for all the guests. I had even pre-ordered custom cupcakes with the company logo, stamped in blue and silver fondant. I stayed in the office late the night before, organizing invoices and confirming headcounts, thinking maybe this milestone would earn me a small nod of recognition. Not a trophy or a speech, just a little appreciation for everything I'd poured into this place for over a decade. But instead, what I got was an email. It came in at 7:48 a.m., sandwiched between a spam newsletter and a calendar invite for the gala walkthrough. The subject line read, "Position Update." I clicked on it expecting something routine, maybe an org chart refresh or a schedule shift, but inside were just 2 dry lines. Your position has been eliminated effective immediately. Please return your badge and any company property by end of day. That was it. No greeting, no explanation, no thank you. Just a cold instruction, followed by a CC line with one name, Miles Rankin. Miles was the newly minted Director of Operations 34, with a freshly ironed Patagonia vest and that forced chill startup bro demeanor. He'd only been there for 4 months, but somehow thought he'd reinvent the company from the inside out. The email didn't even come from him. It was sent by Lisa Carr from HR, a woman I had never met, never spoken to, and wouldn't recognize if she passed me on the street. I remember staring at the screen for a full minute, thinking it had to be some mistake. I even refreshed the page, convinced that the real message was still loading. When it didn't change, I stood up, walked over to the coffee machine in the break room, and just stood there like a ghost. No one else had arrived yet. The fluorescent lights buzzed above me, and all I could think was, after 12 years, this was how it ended? No face-to-face meeting, no handshake, just an email and a bullet point. It wasn't just unprofessional, it was cruel. That morning, I wasn't sad. I wasn't even shocked. I was furious. And underneath that anger, something colder started to form. Something quiet, calculating, and determined. By noon, my badge had stopped working, my inbox was locked, my calendar was scrubbed. I walked out of the building carrying a cardboard box filled with the usual cliches photos, office mugs, a stress ball shaped like a light bulb, and a handwritten note from the CEO's wife thanking me for organizing the staff holiday party 3 years ago. That was the last time anyone from upper management had thanked me for anything. No one said goodbye. No one asked what happened. A few co-workers texted me later that night with awkward emojis and vague condolences, but most just moved on. That was the moment I realized how disposable loyalty is when it's wrapped in corporate branding. You can give a place, your nights, your weekends, your brainpower, your grace, and in the end, All it takes is one cold email to wipe it all away. The worst part? I hadn't seen it coming. Sure, things had shifted when Miles came in. He brought in consultants, restructured departments, and started outsourcing things I used to handle in-house. He made spreadsheets with names like efficiency tracking and resource streamlining, but I never thought it would hit me directly. I'd been there longer than the furniture. I trained half the staff. I knew which vendor would take a PO number over the phone and which one needed it in triplicate. I kept the engine running while everyone else posed in LinkedIn selfies pretending to steer the ship. But none of that mattered. Not to Miles, not to Lisa, not to whoever signed off on that email. In their minds, I was just a salary line they could erase. I didn't respond to the email. I didn't give them the satisfaction. I packed up, turned in my badge, and walked out without a word. But inside, I wasn't done, not by a long shot. I went home, poured a glass of wine, and sat in silence. My brain was buzzing with rage, but also with questions. How could they do this? How could they be so careless? What would happen to the gala? Who would manage payroll next week? Then, as I scrolled through old files looking for anything personal I might have missed, I stumbled on something that made my breath catch. A PDF titled Lease Agreement, 2014. I opened it and stared for a long time at the document on my screen. It wasn't just old paperwork, it was a time bomb, and I was still holding the detonator. Back in 2014, Velmanics had been trying to lease a new facility for their data center. Their credit and revenue history weren't strong enough, and the landlord wasn't convinced they'd be able to keep up with payments. Dave McMillan, the original founder and CEO at the time, had pulled me into his office one afternoon and asked if I'd be willing to help. I had an LLC Doyle ledger and operations that I used for side gigs. Dave asked if I could use it to co-sign the lease, just until the company had built enough credit to take over. I trusted him. He was a good boss back then, the kind of leader who brought coffee to interns and remembered birthdays. I signed the lease under my LLC. We agreed that it would be transferred back to the company within a year, but it never was. Somewhere along the line, that transfer fell through the cracks. Dave retired, the new leadership came in, the finance department changed hands, and no one thought to look back. For 9 years, Velmanics had been operating out of a data center technically leased under my business name. That might have been a harmless clerical error except for one thing. After Miles took over finance, he'd changed their vendor payment systems. I remembered seeing an internal email about the new AP automation software he implemented in January. I logged into the rent account and checked the last payment received. April. It was now July. Velmanics hadn't paid rent in 3 months. I leaned back in my chair and laughed, not because it was funny, but because the irony was too rich to ignore. They'd fired me like I was nobody, like I had nothing to offer, like I had no leverage. But the whole time, I'd been sitting on the one thing they needed most: legal access to the building housing their most sensitive infrastructure. And they were in breach of contract. They weren't just vulnerable, they were exposed. Miles Rankin didn't just cut me loose. He walked his entire company straight into a trap they didn't even know existed. And that, right there, was the moment I stopped being angry and started making a plan. After a week of sulking in silence, I turned off my phone, ignored all the missed calls from friends who didn't know what to say, and spent most of my time on the couch, alternating between watching bad courtroom shows and aimlessly clicking through old files on my laptop. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, maybe just hoping to distract myself with some freelance tax records or leftover vendor contracts I'd saved over the years. It was a strange kind of therapy organizing chaos, so I wouldn't feel mine so much. That's when I found it. Hidden in a folder labeled 2014-Client Docs was a scanned PDF titled Commercial Lease Agreement, Doyle Ledger and Operations. I clicked it without thinking, expecting some long-forgotten invoice or template, but what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. There it was in black and white, a signed lease agreement for a commercial property in Arvada just west of Denver. Not just any property, either. It was the data center Velmanix had been using for the past decade, housing every client project, every system backup, every server they depended on for daily operations. And the name on the lease? Not Velmanix. Not even Dave McMillan. It was mine. Doyle, Ledger, and Ops, my little LLC I'd created for some side hustle work back when I still thought bookkeeping on weekends would be extra income. I'd signed the lease at Dave's request. He was the founder, a good man in his late 50s who trusted me like a partner and didn't want to lose the location to a bigger firm. Back then, Velmanix couldn't qualify for it on their own, and the landlord was skeptical, so Dave asked me to do him a favor. Just for the first year, he'd said. We'll transfer it once we've got the financials. I agreed, signed, and promptly forgot about it. Turns out, they never transferred it. No one ever followed up. I checked the county property records, and sure enough, the leaseholder on file was still my LLC. I felt this weird, tingling calm settle over me, like my brain was slowly assembling puzzle pieces I didn't even know I had. I looked closer at the document 10-year lease, renewable clause, late fee terms, and most importantly, an automatic breach trigger after 60 days of non-payment. That's when I opened the rent account. I'd set it to autopay notification years ago, but since it was never a priority, I barely monitored it anymore. Sure enough, the last successful payment from Velmanix had cleared in April. It was now July. They hadn't paid rent in 3 months. They were 2 weeks past the grace period. My LLC, my little side business that now had no clients and operated out of my kitchen, was technically still their landlord. And they were in breach. I blinked at the screen, reread the dates, then pulled up the ACH logs just to confirm. April 12th, last deposit. May, nothing. June, nothing. July, nothing. I laughed out loud, not because any of this was funny, but because it felt so impossibly absurd. They'd fired me like garbage, sent an email at dawn, stripped my access, kicked me out like I was some replaceable temp with zero legacy. Meanwhile, the entire backbone of their digital infrastructure was sitting inside a building they hadn't paid rent on, leased through me, and no one had noticed. I felt something shift in my chest, the grief of losing my job, the rage of being humiliated so casually, the years of unrecognized labor, they all coalesced into one clear, sharp thought. This wasn't just a mistake. This was leverage. I didn't react immediately. I didn't call anyone or throw a party or start drafting legal threats. I just sat with it. I made tea. I stared at the lease again. I checked to make sure my LLC was still in good standing with the state. And yes, it was. I'd renewed it in January, thinking maybe I'd use it again one day. Well, that day had arrived. I pulled out a notepad and began writing everything I could remember about the building, the original deal, the changes in finance at Velmanix, and most critically, who was responsible now. That led me to one name, Miles Rankin, the man who'd taken over operations, who'd outsourced finance to a firm in Austin called Rovalin Group, who'd pushed out all the internal accounting staff and replaced them with some shiny automation software that clearly didn't work. He probably had no clue what he'd overlooked. By the next morning, I had printed copies of the lease, payment logs, and my LLC's registration status. I emailed Claire, my cousin, who works as a paralegal for a real estate law firm downtown, and asked her if she could take a look. She texted back within an hour, "Holy you weren't kidding. You own their backbone." She asked me to come by that afternoon. I brought the entire folder in a recycled gift bag that still had tissue paper in it. Claire reviewed every page like she was auditing a will. When she was done, she looked at me with that half smile she always gets when she smells blood in the water. "If they haven't paid rent and the lease is still valid, you can absolutely initiate eviction," she said, "especially if they didn't renew with you directly. This is gold, Karen." I wasn't sure I wanted to go nuclear. Not yet. I wanted them to sweat first. I wanted Miles to realize what kind of mistake he'd made, not just firing me, but ignoring something as fundamental as who owned the roof over his servers. I asked Claire to recommend a lawyer who specialized in business property disputes. She gave me a name, Janine Travers. "She's a bulldog in pumps," Claire said. You want justice and drama? She'll get you both. I called Janine that evening. Her assistant picked up, then patched me through. Janine listened, asked 2 questions, then told me to come in the next morning. Bring every scrap of documentation, she said, and wear something you don't mind power walking in. At Janine's office, I laid out the lease, the payment records, and a photo of the building from Google Maps. She examined it all like a general preparing battle strategy. They're dead in the water, she said finally. They've been occupying a building for 3 months, without paying rent, to a legally valid leaseholder. You're well within your rights to serve them a demand to cure or vacate. And if they don't respond in 48 hours, we escalate to eviction. Let's file. My hands were shaking when I signed the retainer agreement. Not from fear, from adrenaline. This wasn't a petty act. It was professional, legal, and entirely deserved. The next step was choosing how to serve the notice. I could have mailed it. But Janine said it would be far more effective to hand deliver. Enter Rick, her preferred process server, a retired firefighter in his 50s with a deep voice and zero patience for corporate nonsense. I handed him the sealed envelope with the demand notice and instructions to deliver it to Velmanic's HQ, addressed to Miles Rankin. Do I smile when I give it to him? Rick asked. No, I said, just give it to him and walk away. That was Thursday. By Friday morning at 9:16 a.m., I had an email from Rick with the subject line, served. Attached was a time-stamped photo of Miles standing in the glass lobby of Velmanic's, holding the envelope and looking like he'd just swallowed a wasp. The deadline was set, 48 hours to either pay 3 months' rent in full, plus late fees, or vacate the premises entirely. I didn't expect them to respond right away. Miles was the kind of guy who thought everything could be handled with a Google Doc and a team huddle. But this wasn't a brainstorming session. This was legal. This was binding. And if they thought I was bluffing, they were about to learn otherwise. I turned my phone back on, waited, and watched. I didn't hear from Miles that day, but Lisa from HR emailed a vague inquiry. Karen, we received a document today and just want to confirm its validity, to which I replied with a PDF attachment labeled Lease Agreement Signed.pdf and the message, yes, it's valid. Please refer all future communications to my attorney, Janine Travers. That shut them up for a while. I could imagine the scramble behind those walls. The hurried Slack messages, the emergency Zoom calls. The realization that the building they'd taken for granted was now in legal jeopardy, and there was nothing they could do about it without going through me. I didn't want money. I didn't want an apology. I wanted them to understand that loyalty isn't disposable, that you can't erase someone's legacy and expect the past to stay quiet. Velmanic's was about to learn what it felt like to be locked out of your own kingdom, and I held the keys. The first night after confirming the lease was still in my name, I couldn't sleep. I just laid there, staring at the ceiling fan, listening to it click with every rotation. At first, I thought maybe I'd send Velmanic's a formal notice, tack on some late fees, and ask for a quiet settlement. I imagined they'd write a check, apologize through some junior associate in HR, and sweep it all under the rug. But then I thought about Miles Rankin. That smug little nod he gave me in the elevator the week before. He fired me, like he already knew I was disposable. How he didn't even have the basic human decency to call. No handshake, no exit interview. Just an email at 6:41 a.m. with the subject line, restructure notification. I remembered all of that, and my plan changed. I called my cousin Elena the next morning. She's 36, works as a paralegal for a commercial real estate firm in Colorado Springs, and has the kind of voice that always sounds like she's 3 moves ahead of whatever you're thinking. I gave her the rundown, sent over the lease, the payment records, and the LLC filings. She called me back in 20 minutes and practically shouted through the phone. Karen, you have them by the throat. I could hear her flipping pages while she talked. They breached lease terms. They haven't paid in 90 days, and your LLC still has full authority. This isn't some technicality. You own that space legally, and they're squatting. You could go scorched earth. And that's exactly what I intended to do. I told Elena I didn't want to check. Not this time. I wanted them to feel what they'd done. I wanted every cold, dismissive decision Miles made to come crashing back down around his head. So Elena said, "You need Janelle." Janelle Monroe, 42, real estate attorney, top of her class at Georgetown, known for being surgical in court filings, and absolutely relentless in enforcement. Her firm, Monroe and Satterfield, was based in Denver and took high-stakes commercial cases. Elena put us in touch that same afternoon. Janelle called me from her car while heading into a hearing. I gave her the basics. She paused for 3 seconds and said, "This won't take long. Email me everything. Let's shut them down properly." Janelle had a tone I liked immediately. Calm, clipped, but completely in control. When I met her the next morning, she was wearing a gray pantsuit, no jewelry, just red nail polish and quiet confidence. We sat in a conference room with soundproof walls, and she laid out the strategy like it was a military operation. "We serve them a demand for possession," she explained. "Give them 48 hours. If they fail to cure the rent default, we file an unlawful detainer and request a court-ordered eviction. Colorado statute is clear. They've violated lease terms. And you, Karen, are in the legal right. We don't threaten. We act." I signed the paperwork right then and there, hands steady. That's when Janelle introduced me to Reggie. Reggie Evans, 64, retired sheriff from Mesa County, who now moonlights as a licensed process server. Big guy, gray beard, moves like someone who doesn't waste time. Janelle handed him the sealed envelope with a quiet, "Give this to their operations director personally." He nodded once and left. That was a Thursday. The notice was official. Velmanics had 48 hours to pay all back rent, including fees, or vacate the property completely. It was legal. It was direct. And it was coming for them like a freight train. For once, I didn't feel like a forgotten cog in their machine. I felt like the engine. Friday morning at exactly 10:02 a.m., I got a message from Reggie. It was a photo of Miles standing in the Velmanics lobby, holding the envelope like it was a dead rat. The timestamp was clear. The delivery was clean. And just like that, the countdown started. 48 hours. I imagined the meeting that followed, the internal panic, the frantic calls to legal, the Slack channels lighting up like a Christmas tree. I knew they'd try to stall. That's what companies like Velmanics always did when caught off guard. But this time, they weren't dealing with a junior analyst or a disgruntled intern. They were dealing with the woman they tried to erase. They didn't call me. Instead, around 1:30 that afternoon, I got a message from Lisa, HR coordinator. Maybe 30, always too cheerful. Her email subject line was, "Notice clarification." She wrote, "Hi, Karen. Hope you're doing well. We received a document from a gentleman today and just wanted to confirm the legitimacy of the contents before forwarding it to counsel. Let us know at your earliest convenience." I didn't reply immediately. I forwarded it to Janelle, who responded with one line. "Don't engage. I'll reply formally." But I couldn't resist a little personal touch. So I opened a fresh email window, attached the scanned copy of the lease, and wrote, "It's valid. Refer all communications to my attorney." Then hit send. By that evening, Lisa had gone silent. No follow-up, no calls, no replies. Saturday came and went without a word from Velmanics. No courier, no payments, nothing. Meanwhile, Janelle filed the eviction paperwork in Arapahoe County Court. We didn't have to wait for the 48-hour deadline to expire. We just had to show a breach, and we had more than enough documentation. The court date was requested for the following Thursday. That gave them less than a week to figure out just how badly they'd screwed up. I wasn't hiding. I posted a picture of my morning coffee on Instagram with the caption, "Starting fresh." It wasn't subtle, and I didn't want it to be. Sunday morning, I got a text from an unknown number. "Karen, it's Miles. Can we talk?" I stared at it for a full minute before locking my phone. He had my number the whole time, never used it when I was terminated. But now that I held the lease, suddenly he wanted a conversation. I didn't reply. I forwarded the message to Janelle, who sent back, "Block him. We'll handle communication through official channels." So I did. I blocked him. Not out of spite, but out of principle. He made his choices. He built a company that rewarded loyalty with silence. Now he could sit in that silence and sweat. Monday came, and Janelle called to say she'd heard from Velmanix's in-house counsel. They weren't denying the breach, but they were trying to negotiate. They offered to pay 2 months of rent immediately and settle the third after a financial review. Janelle laughed when she told me. "That's not how breaches work," she said. "We're not bartering at a garage sale. They vacate or pay in full now, or we proceed." I told her to hold firm. There was no way I was letting them squirm out of this with a discount. They owed me more than rent. They owed me respect, and respect isn't negotiable. That same day, I got a message on LinkedIn from a former coworker, Nate, who used to handle back-end systems. He wrote, "Hey, heard some wild stuff going down. Can't say more, but if it's true, I hope you're doing okay. Proud of you." I smiled reading it. Nate wasn't the kind to stir drama. For him to reach out meant people inside Velmanix were talking, and that was exactly what I wanted. Not revenge in the petty sense, but exposure. A spotlight on the carelessness, the arrogance, the assumption that people like me wouldn't fight back. Well, I had. And the fight wasn't over yet. By Tuesday, the Velmanix servers had already been flagged internally for risk. I knew this because another quiet supporter from inside, someone I won't name, messaged me a screenshot. Just a small red banner across the top of a Slack channel reading, "Internal infra risk. Do not modify server routes." It made me laugh out loud. I wasn't inside their building anymore, but I was in their heads. And no amount of crisis PR or emergency all-hands meetings could undo the fact that I legally owned their heartbeat. The countdown was almost done, and I wasn't going to blink. Wednesday morning, Janelle called to say the court had approved the expedited hearing. Velmanix had until Thursday at 9 a.m. to either wire the full amount owed or show up in court, prepared to defend why they were still occupying a leased space they had no right to. No stall tactics. No more smirks. This was the end of the line. I spent that evening alone, sitting at my kitchen table with a glass of wine, flipping through the original lease again. It had yellowed a bit from time, but it still held power. So did I. For the first time in weeks, I slept straight through the night. The clock was ticking, and every second that passed wasn't just about reclaiming my dignity. It was about sending a message. You don't get to treat people like footnotes and expect them to disappear. Sometimes the ones you cast aside come back with the paperwork that makes everything crumble. I wasn't just serving notice. I was rewriting the ending they thought they'd already written for me. And this time, I was holding the pen. They didn't take it seriously at first. Miles actually laughed when Reggie handed him the envelope. Gavin told me later that he shrugged, tossed it on the front desk like it was a delivery mistake, and went back into the glass-walled conference room. That was how Velmanix worked. Arrogance before comprehension. Taryn Willis, their 38-year-old VP of infrastructure, called me the next morning, all faux cordial tones and artificial grace. She opened with, "Hi, Karen. Let's be adults here. I'm sure this is just a miscommunication." I let her talk for 2 minutes before I quietly said, "Check your email." I'd already sent her the PDF of the signed lease and the 3 months of unpaid rent notices. I didn't add anything else. I hung up. 2 hours later, I got the first call from Brian Cutler, their CEO. Brian was 49, tall, silver-haired, and had once given a whole TEDx talk on foundational humility in tech. The same man who never made eye contact with me in the elevator. He called me 3 times in a span of 90 minutes. I ignored everyone. My phone buzzed like a fire alarm, but I didn't flinch. Let them sweat. By the end of day 1, I got a text from Gavin Lee, their 26-year-old IT associate who always brought me extra login tokens and helped debug without asking for credit. His message was short and sweet. They're scrambling. Nobody can figure out how this happened. Taryn's freaking out. I could practically hear the panic through the screen. That night, my inbox looked like someone had smashed a glass emergency box. I had messages from HR, legal, facilities, and even a senior finance analyst I didn't recognize. Each message tried a different tone. Some pleaded, some threatened, some acted confused. I didn't open any of them. I just forwarded them all to Janelle. She replied to each with the same calm line. Per the lease terms, the eviction stands. I pictured her typing it out over and over with surgical precision, her red nails clicking against the keyboard. She didn't elaborate. She didn't argue. She didn't flinch. They'd had their chance to be reasonable, and now the walls were closing in. Day 2, the spin machine kicked in. Someone from their internal PR department, Jessica something, emailed me directly saying they were exploring collaborative resolutions and would welcome the opportunity to settle outside of litigation. I forwarded that to Janelle too. Same reply. Then they tried the tech angle. I got a vague letter from their CIO stating that due to critical infrastructure dependencies, they needed continued, uninterrupted access to the facility for at least 60 days. The letter didn't mention rent, didn't acknowledge the lease breach, just a lot of big words dressed up to sound like law. I didn't even reply. Janelle sent back a short letter that ended with the line, "Eviction proceedings are not subject to speculative dependencies. Payment or removal is required." Gavin messaged again that afternoon. Cutler looked like he aged 5 years overnight, he wrote. Taryn screamed at 2 people in the break room this morning. They're locked in meetings all day. IT has no backup plan. It was surreal to hear about their unraveling from the inside. I wasn't there, but in a way, I was everywhere. My name was probably on every whiteboard, every Zoom call, every Slack message thread. All the people who had dismissed me as finance support were now begging for answers I didn't owe them. They'd built their empire on shortcuts, and I just pulled the keystone out from under them. By the 3rd day, Brian finally tried a new tactic. He had their corporate counsel send over what they called a provisional settlement offer. It was 4 pages long, full of passive language about unintended oversights and temporary administrative gaps, and offered to pay 2 months' rent immediately with a retroactive adjustment pending audit. I read it 3 times. Not once did they acknowledge my name as the leaseholder, or the fact that their system depended on a building they no longer had legal claim to. I called Janelle. She said, "Karen, if we respond, it legitimizes their delay. We file the eviction. Let the court handle it." So we did. The hearing was set for the next morning, Thursday at 9 a.m. By Wednesday afternoon, Janelle had already filed all supporting documents. The judge, from what we heard, was strict with commercial compliance and unlikely to entertain corporate gymnastics. Around 4 p.m., Brian called again. This time, I answered, just to hear the tone in his voice. He said, "Karen, surely we can find some middle ground here. We don't need to go nuclear." I said, "Middle ground would have been a conversation before you had me fired by email." He sighed. "We didn't know about the lease. It wasn't intentional." I said, "Ignorance doesn't cancel contracts. It just proves you run a sloppy ship." He started to respond, but I ended the call. That night, I got a final message from Gavin. "They're printing backup drives like it's Y2K. Facilities locked all door logs. I heard Taryn crying in the hallway. I didn't enjoy their pain, but I wasn't above feeling vindicated. I didn't cause this chaos. They did when they chose Rees and Dar. They were my chinjories. Egaregery sur ego, over respect, speed over substance. I simply reminded them that the foundation they built wasn't as solid as they thought. I wasn't some disposable staffer, I was the landlord. And landlords don't get laid off. They get paid, or they get possession. The morning of the hearing, I wore a navy suit and low heels. Nothing dramatic, just professional enough to make a point. Janelle met me at the courthouse steps, already reading over her notes. We didn't need to say much. She had everything airtight. Velmenix's attorney showed up flustered and 15 minutes late. The judge didn't appreciate that. He asked one question. Is the lease valid and unpaid? Janelle replied, Yes, Your Honor. 3 months overdue, served notice, no payment. The other side fumbled with excuses about internal miscommunication, but the judge waved it off. Pay or vacate, he said. You've got 72 hours. That ruling hit Velmonix like a hammer. No stay, no delay. The sheriff's department was authorized to assist with the eviction if needed. By Friday, they had to be out. By Monday, I could change the locks. The moment the gavel dropped, Brian's lawyer slumped like someone pulled the plug on him. Janelle smiled without showing her teeth. I didn't say anything. I just nodded once and walked out of the courtroom like I'd walked out of their building weeks before. Quiet, composed, and entirely in control. They spent the next 3 days in total meltdown. IT tried to transfer servers, but they ran out of time and space. I heard they had to emergency migrate systems to a third-party host in Dallas, costing them hundreds of thousands. Staff worked double shifts, contractors came in overnight. But nothing could undo the reality. They no longer had legal access to the most important piece of real estate in their operations chain. And I wasn't lifting a finger to help. They built this fire. I just let the air in. By Saturday, the building was quiet. I walked through it with Reggie and a locksmith. Cubicles half-packed, cables unplugged, coffee cups still sitting on desks. I stood in the server room, empty now except for the hum of forgotten fans, and I thought, this used to be where I worked. Now it's just a trophy. One they handed me by underestimating the wrong person. And I wasn't done, not by a long shot. Exactly 48 hours after Reggie served the notice, I sat in a rented black SUV parked across the street from the data center. It was a quiet Thursday morning, the kind of stillness that comes before a thunderclap. I had a large coffee in one hand and Janelle's private security team on speed dial. At 9 a.m. sharp, they pulled up in a dark gray van, stepped out calmly in polos and utility belts, and walked right in with the master key. 10 minutes later, the locks were changed. I didn't flinch. I just watched. It didn't look like revenge. It looked like routine. But I knew what it meant. Inside, those servers weren't just wires and lights. They were the lungs of Velmanix. Everything from their client dashboards to their internal HR systems lived inside that cage of blinking blue LEDs. And now, the lights were going dark. Gavin, my quiet little mole from IT, sent me a single text at 9:26 a.m. Offline. That was all I needed. No drama, no confrontation, no fiery showdown, just silence and the unmistakable hum of a system shutting down for good. I deleted the text and turned off my phone. It was done. They didn't have backups, not good ones anyway. I knew that because I used to manage the disaster recovery plans, and ever since they outsourced IT to that sketchy firm in Texas, the protocols had been hopeful at best. I found out later from Elena that within hours, payroll systems failed. Emails stopped working. Client portals locked out thousands of users. By sunset, they were dead in the water. And not just that week, 2 major clients pulled their contracts before the weekend. One was a hospital system in Phoenix. The other was a fintech startup with deep pockets and no patience for downtime. Brian Cutler, the CEO, finally sent me an email the next morning. It was polite. Too polite. He offered a settlement to remedy the disruption and proposed we move toward a constructive resolution. I didn't reply. Janelle did, though with one line. Please direct all communications through legal counsel. That was her way of saying, you lost. I didn't need money. I had enough. What I needed was acknowledgement. What I got was silence. That suited me fine. No one from the company ever apologized. Not one person. Not Miles, not Taryn, not even Lisa from HR, who used to bake banana bread for birthdays. All those years of working overtime, keeping the books clean, managing vendor chaos, they vanished like I never existed. But the data center didn't vanish. It stood there, locked and humming, a monument to the thing they forgot they didn't own. And in that forgetfulness, they gave me all the power I needed. That night, I had dinner at a rooftop bar downtown. Not to celebrate. I wasn't in the mood for champagne or selfies. I just needed air. I ordered grilled salmon and a glass of Cabernet and sat alone by the glass railing, watching traffic roll past 20 stories below. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just stared at the skyline and let the silence sink in. It wasn't the peace of winning. It was something sharper, thinner, like a quiet click deep inside me, finally locking something shut. That night, I had dinner at a rooftop bar downtown, not to celebrate. I wasn't in the mood for champagne or selfies. I just needed air. I ordered grilled salmon and a glass of Cabernet and sat alone by the glass railing, watching traffic roll past 20 stories below. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just stared at the skyline and let the silence sink in. It wasn't the peace of winning. It was something sharper, thinner, like a quiet click deep inside me, finally locking something shut. After 12 years of loyalty, I wasn't invisible anymore. I'd been erased by an email, but I answered with ink and law. They fired me with a subject line. I responded with a blackout. Not out of rage, not out of vengeance, but because they thought I wouldn't. And that's the thing people never understand. It's not the loud ones they should worry about. It's the ones who leave quietly and take the keys with them.